something.
Yeah. Keep talking, so I said, we got some trouble.
I talk except when I want to, huh?
That's all right. A little bit loud, you turn it down and keep going.
All righty, good. Let me give you your assignment, please, for October 10th, next Wednesday. Just write by number 6, October 10th. In class today are to be reviewed before you come to class next Wednesday. Do that all the way through. If some of you want to improve your grade, one of the simplest ways to do it would be that you not only review from one week to the next, but that you review more than is required. That is, go right back to the beginning and review all the way through the semester. All right, number 6, October 10th. Pastor Wood, any special assignment? I mean, any special announcements, what I meant?
I don't think so.
Oh.
I tell you, the picture's not too good, I don't know why. So, if you could give me a minute, let me check it, okay? I need to run it backwards and rewind it, see what happens.
You make me very sensitive on that now, that picture's not very good. Maybe it never is.
And then there's 2 times we use the others about catching ourselves $3. Go ahead, I don't know what to do. I'll put a new tape in, I'm hoping that's good.
Well, I'm so handsome that anything that shows my picture is bound to be good.
Go ahead, Mr. O'Donnell.
All right, fine. We'll ask Pastor Wood to lead our prayer, please.
Our Father, we do thank you for these classes, and I pray that thou will especially put in the minds of the young folk in our school today, Lord, that they might somehow have some sense of what a valuable thing being offered to them to be able to sit in these classes, learn from thy servant. And Lord, we do pray about the mechanical aspect of these classes, the videoing, the taping, and ask that thou will work right. We ask for Christ's sake. Amen.
Amen. Up at the top of page 51, we come to the 5th result of redemption, obedience in connection with the law of God. Put again your note in the margin, see page 44. On page 44 we have the whole outline of the book of Exodus along with the diagram that I suggested. So I'd like for you to review that from time to time and just write that in the margin here. The 5th result of redemption is obedience pictured by the 10 Commandments and the law in Exodus 20 to 24. How long was Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai? Now, I don't know whether I need to change one of these or not. Exodus 19:1 and Numbers 10:11. Did I say 10:10 or 10:11? Change it to 10:11. Numbers 10:11. When you compare those, you'll see that Israel was at the foot of Mount Sinai for about a year. Now, why is so much space devoted to this? 59 chapters devoted to this year in Old Testament history. Go back to the first 2 chapters of Genesis. How much space in Genesis is devoted to the story of creation? Just 2 chapters, Genesis 1 and 2. But 59 chapters are devoted to this time that Israel is at the foot of Mount Sinai for a year. Now, this is what we call the selective element in the writing of the Bible. The Bible is not the story of everything that happened. The Bible is the story of salvation. The Bible is the story of redemption. And whenever you have any particular year, any particular period to which much space is devoted, you know that's unusually important and strategic in the history of redemption. During the time when the Israelites were encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai, God was accomplishing for them three chief things which were important in the history of redemption. From a quick glance at Exodus 19:1 to Numbers 10:10, by remembering what you would have needed if you'd been a slave of the Egyptians for many years, show how this period was important in the history of redemption. You see, God did not take them directly from the land of Goshen over into the land of Canaan. By a direct route from Goshen to Canaan, it was just about 100 miles. But God took them in what seemed to be a roundabout way because they weren't ready for Canaan yet. Oftentimes when God leads you and me in answer to prayer, he seems to be leading in a very roundabout way. You know the saying, the straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. And we often think that God ought to lead us according to that straight line, the shortest distance between 2 points. Usually he doesn't do that. Usually he leads in what is not an indirect way, but what seems to us to be an indirect way. And then we find that when we get to that place and the prayer is answered, God has taken us through other things, and he's taught us other lessons that we wouldn't have learned if we'd gone in a more direct manner. Israel wasn't ready yet to go into the land of Canaan. It was just 100 miles from Goshen over into Canaan, but God didn't take them that 100-mile route. He took them a much longer route. I want to mention three things that God is accomplishing through this time when Israel is at the foot of Mount Sinai. The first is he rested them. You see, that's connected with the question I asked, what would you have needed if you had been a slave of the Egyptians for so many years? You see, not only did they do very hard work, but they did hard work that draw a great deal of chastisement. And you know, some people just love to be cruel to others. People often call them sadistic. They're sadistic, and they get pleasure through the suffering of others. Well, please remember that your natural heart is sadistic. My natural heart's sadistic. And it may take a very refined outlet to it. It may manifest itself in a refined sort of way. But yours naturally sadistic, and I am. See, these slave masters just beat the Israelites unmercifully. They just beat them unmercifully. Well, what would you have needed? You'd have needed rest. And that's always one of the main needs of Christians. It's physical rest. Physical rest. Some people think that if they take physical rest, they're really sinning against the Lord. Well, it is true that some physical rest is due to laziness. But I believe it overactivity among Christians is just as much a sin as the sin of laziness. How many times have you said to somebody, now don't be lazy? How many times have you said, don't be overactive? Usually you haven't said that. But we need that rest. A lot of preachers have their nerves on edge a great deal of the time because they don't rest enough. And they're afraid somebody will criticize them. Well, it may be laziness. It's often said that you can be lazier in the ministry than almost any other thing, and that's true. But we need rest. And when you're in God's will, you can expect the Lord to work supernaturally to give you the rest you need. Sometimes students in a school will say, well, we can't rest because the faculty members pour it on. They pour it on too much. Because of that, we can't get the rest we need. Yes, you can always get the rest you need if you're looking to the Lord. He may send snow sometime and cancel school for a while. Or he may work in 1,000,001 other ways. But God will work supernaturally to give you the rest you need. Give me the rest I need if our eyes are fixed on him. The second thing God did for them at that time was that he organized them. See, Israel was a nation now. They had between 2 and 3 million people. Now let me repeat, you know how we get that idea between 2 and 3 million people? We get it from the first chapter of Numbers, which shows how Moses numbered God's people about a year after they came out of Egypt. So you see, that would be just about the same as you have before. There were 603,000 plus men able to go forth to war, plus all the men under fighting age and all the men over fighting age, plus all the girls and women. And when you put all that together, you'll have 2 to 3 million Israelites. That's how you get it. They were a nation numerically, but they weren't organized. And one of the most important things in God's work is a good organization. There's no doubt about the fact that some churches and some groups are over-organized. You may have heard a person say, it's easier to organize than it is to agonize. We need to agonize in prayer. That's true, but it's also true that one of the great spiritual gifts God gives to some people, He doesn't give them to everybody, is the gift of organization. You take Pastor Wood and those who are working with him here have these things organized. I'm not an organizer. I don't think that's my spiritual gift. If it is, I've certainly missed it, because I'm not an organizer, but I benefit through his gift of organization and through others' gift of organization. And you find that sometimes in a certain work, God may call you not to be a teacher of a certain group or a preacher to a certain group, but in that group, God may call you to organize. Be sure you agonize along with the organizing, because those two things are important. That's the second thing. God rested them and He organized them. And then the third is He instructed them. And you have all this instruction about the law of God and the laws of God, and about the tabernacle, how to worship God. And oh, how Christians need this. The average church member is not instructed in the things of God. He's not instructed in the things of God. I think one reason is that often we think, well, your church service is not in vain if you get an invitation. You know, be sure you give an invitation and you get somebody to come to the altar, then it's not in vain. Well, I believe there are times when it's God's will to give the invitation. Some have the rule they never have a service without an invitation. Well, that's between them and the Lord. I personally don't do that myself, because I think that often an invitation does not tie in with the type of sermon that's given. And often the preacher will preach a sermon on a certain subject, and then he'll come and give an invitation to accept Christ. And it has no direct relation to the sermon that is given. I believe the invitation ought to have a relation to the sermon that's given. But people differ on that, and I think they differ in their calling from God on that. I don't criticize the person who does it, but often preachers are so busy pointing up to that invitation that they don't instruct people in the things of God. And many church officers just are like little babies as far as the knowledge of God's truth is concerned. All right, 3 things God did for them during this week. Why are 59 chapters devoted to this 1 year? Because it's so important in the history of redemption. God rested them, God organized them, and God instructed them. And when He does those things for me, those things are important in the history of redemption in my life. And when He does these things for you, these things are important in your life as far as the history of redemption is concerned. Now we come to general questions about the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments as a revelation of God. I've told you before that many neglect the 10 Commandments today. Some who neglect them really think they're scriptural. They think that the Bible says that we aren't to keep the 10 Commandments now in this present age. But if I neglect the 10 Commandments, then I am neglecting one of the things God's given me to give a fresh revelation of God Himself. Nobody can have the right revelation of God if he doesn't have a revelation of God through the 10 Commandments. That isn't the only way God does it, but that's one of the ways in which He does it. Let me mention 3 great attributes or qualities of God which I find in the 10 Commandments. The first is the grace of God. Somebody says, I believe in the grace of God. I don't believe in teaching children the 10 Commandments. Now don't forget, on your examination, you're going to be held responsible for the 10 Commandments in order. as they're listed on these pages. The reason I mention as they're listed on these pages is, I suppose we don't have anybody here who's a Lutheran. Do we have anybody here who's a Lutheran? You see, the Lutherans break up the first commandment into, how do they do that? Put the first two commandments in one. That's the way they do it. And then their numbering is different all the way through. I had a student in my class who was a Lutheran once, and he said, really, it's hard for me to say what's the second or the third or the fourth commandment, because my numbering's different. And I said, well, you'll have to bear with us, and we'll have to go along, because most of the class is taught the other way. But whenever anybody mentions the fourth commandment, you ought to know immediately what that is. See if you can tell me. What is the fourth commandment? It's the only one of the Ten Commandments not repeated in the epistles of the New Testament. Now, which is it? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And I want you to know all 10 of those commandments, you'll be responsible for them. We used to have the Ten Commandments taught to children. Not much more these days. It's been a long time since I've seen a group of children being taught the Ten Commandments. We need it. Now, we're not saved by the Ten Commandments, and that's one reason why I'm going into detail. The Ten Commandments show me I need to be saved. I need to be kept by the power of God. And certainly nobody can be saved or kept by obeying the Ten Commandments. All right, the first is the grace of God. Notice the first commandment, chapter 20, verse 1. I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. What's the first commandment? Somebody says the first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Yes and no. Yes, thou shalt have no other gods before me, first commandment. No. The first commandment is, I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, by the blood of the Passover lamb. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Second commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Yes and no. The second commandment is, I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, by the blood of the Passover lamb. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And so on all the way through. Years ago I heard Dr. Charles G. Trumbull, editor of the Sunday School Times, say that God never expects us to do one thing for him until first of all he has done everything for us. God never expects us to do one thing for him until first of all he's done everything for us. Now you take the book of Ephesians that I was teaching in a place up in North Carolina this summer. The first 3 chapters, what God has done for us. And then the last 3 chapters, our responsibility as a result of that. See, in the first 3 chapters, you have almost nothing of what we're to do for God. The average preacher doesn't preach that way. The average preacher would take the first 3 chapters of Ephesians. But then I know there's one group up in Virginia that would preach it like this. They take, oh, God's done this for me, therefore I ought to be a soul winner. He's done this for me, therefore I ought to be a soul winner. But see, the first 3 chapters of Ephesians don't say that. Is it important to be a soul winner? Yes, but don't mix those things together all the time. You see, in fact, Paul adds an extra chapter in Ephesians. Right at the beginning of the 3rd chapter, he started to plunge into the second part of the work, but then he went right back and told more of what God had done for us in Christ. Each one of the 10 commandments is built on the grace of God. I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, by the blood of the Passover lamb. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And if you want to drive that home sometime, you can just repeat it 10 times for each one of the 10 commandments. Now, let me write this on the board because people talk about it over and over. What they call the Judeo-Christian ethic. They spell it G-A-U-D-A-E-O Christian, C-H-R-I-S-T-I-A-N. The Judeo-Christian ethic. And what they're really saying is that although Jews and Christians don't agree on Christ, yet they agree on the Ten Commandments. They agree on the law of God. No, that's a misnomer, that Judeo-Christian ethic. We don't agree with the Jews on the Ten Commandments because the Jews have rejected the blood. In the Jewish ceremonies, they have almost no shedding of blood. They say that they adhere to the religion of the Old Testament. That's one of the main ways to approach a Jew. Often we say, hear the prophecies, and Christ fulfills the prophecies. That's one way to do it. And Matthew does that. The Bible does that. But that isn't the only way to do it. You say, I believe in the religion of the Old Testament. You do? Well, you don't have any shedding of blood of animals. You've given that up completely. I understand there's one little incidental ceremony in which the rabbi wrings a chicken's neck. And that's all the shedding of blood they have. You see, Judaism is a great disease of self-righteousness. It's a great disease of self-righteousness. I don't need blood shed for my sins. That's what a Jew would say. And if you've ever dealt with one, I tell you, you realize they are really angry if you even hint that they need to be saved. Need to be saved. Oh, how we need to love them. But we need to take our stand on this, and I hope you'll never talk about that Judeo-Christian ethic. Could I ask for hands? How many of you have ever used that expression, the Judeo-Christian ethic? Could I see your hands? None in here? Maybe you're too dumb to do it? Is that the idea? No, so many use it. How many of you have heard it? Oh, you just hear it all the time. No, indeed. You see, we don't agree with the Jews on the Ten Commandments. They're built on the fact, I am the Lord thy God who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, by the blood of the Passover lamb. And then the different commandments are given. All right, the grace of God is revealed through the commandments. If I neglect the Ten Commandments, I neglect the grace of God. Then the second is the holiness of God. To neglect the Ten Commandments is to neglect the holiness of God. I believe that two of the most effective ways of teaching the holiness of God are first to emphasize the truth of hell. There's an eternal hell for all who don't know Christ. Somebody might say, I believe God's holy. I believe God's holy. And then if he hears the truth of hell being preached, he says, don't teach that, especially to children. Don't talk about hell to little children. You'll scare them. You'll scare them wrongly. Don't do that. Well, there's a wrong way of scaring people. It certainly is true. But one of the best ways to show the holiness of God is to take the full meaning of the Ten Commandments. And that's why we're going to take quite a while to go into this in detail. And then the second effective way of teaching the holiness of God is to teach the Ten Commandments. Hell and the full meaning of the Ten Commandments. How holy God is. I can just say, how holy he is. But then when I realize how high his standards are, what a difference it makes. Now, you know, today a lot of people think that in Christian schools you shouldn't have any standards where you don't have a chapter and verse scripture for the standard. It's not enough to have it built on the principle of God. And you know the whole idea about wearing shorts, girls wearing shorts, fellas wearing shorts and so forth. A lot of people just laugh at that and they say, that's old-timey stuff. I don't believe that's old-timey, that's Bible-timey. That's built on Bible truths, Bible principles. It isn't my purpose to go into that detail, but to say when you lower the standards of dress in any group, you lower the vision of God's holiness. You lower the vision of God's holiness. And I'm not trying to settle every one of these details, but how we need that. So the holiness of God is revealed through the Ten Commandments. Then the third is the authority of God. People in general don't want anybody to have authority over them. You know, the way they express it these days. I just found this in the last few years. Maybe they had it before. But the idea is you don't have any right to insist on your way of life for me. See, that you tell us this, well, that's just your way of life. Your way of life, no, that's the authority of God. That's the authority of God. And we must be sure that when we insist on those things, we do have them clearly stated in terms of the authority of God. In Psalm 2, it said, we will not have this man to rule over us. We'll not have this man to rule over us. That's the natural heart of man. It doesn't want to bow before authority. As far as I know, this group that we have at the present is as subject to authority as any group we've had during the 10 years I've been teaching here. I came here in 1980. And as far as I know, it's as subject to authority as any group we've had. But remember, your natural heart's a rebellious heart. And my natural heart's a rebellious heart. Nobody is naturally obedient. Some people are naturally quiet. Some people are naturally noisy. But nobody's naturally obedient. All right? At least 3 great revelations of God given in the 10 Commandments. The grace of God, the holiness of God, and the authority of God. What people in the world often say, you can hear it on the radio in these talk programs. If you tell a person not to do something, you make him want to do it. Could I ask how many of you have heard that? If you tell a person not to do something, you make him want to do it. Well, see, that's accusing God of sin and of causing sin, because God says, thou shalt not. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And if I say that you make a person want to do it by telling him not to do it, then you're making God the author of sin. Now, it is true that sometimes we do say too frequently, don't do it. Did I tell you about the little girl named Susie? People said don't to her so long, she thought don't was her first name. What's your name? Don't Susie, she said. Don't Susie. You can overdo it. Surely, you can abuse it. But oh, we need that. And I tell you, I get a great deal of my leading from the Lord and going forward in the Lord through the don'ts of the Bible. It just has a punch to it, authority to it. I believe it's true that the average preacher does not have enough of the negative in his preaching. He doesn't have enough of the negative. Now, it must be based on the finished work of Christ. But the negative is all important. Christ's summary of the 10 Commandments. Please read carefully Matthew 22, in which the Lord Jesus summarized all the commandments in 2 parts. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Show how these 2 commandments summarize the 10 Commandments. In Exodus 32 and 34, the Bible says, God wrote his law upon 2 tables of stone. In connection with your answer to the above question, indicate how many commandments you believe to have been written on each table of stone and show why you so believe. Look at the board for just a moment, and this is the 2 tables. These are the 2 tables of the law. The first one, love for God. The second one, love for neighbor. Now let me ask, how many of these 10 commandments have to do especially with love for God, and how many have to do especially with love for neighbor? People often say that the first 4 commandments were on the first table of stone, love for God, and the last 6 commandments are on the second table of stone. Could I ask how many of you got that answer as you read this passage? Many have that, and you have good company if you teach it. There are many others who teach what I believe to be true, that the commandments were equally divided. The first 5 commands were on the first table of stone, love for God. And the last 5 commands, love for neighbor, were on the second table of stone. You see, it introduces to the question, where do you put the 5th commandment? The 5th commandment is honor thy father and thy mother. Does the 5th commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, belong on the first table of stone, love for God, or on the second table of stone, love for neighbor? I believe it belongs on the first table of stone, because he's not talking about mother and father as neighbors. He's talking about mother and father as the special representatives of God. And oh, how important this is. Some of you have parents who are saved. Thank the Lord. You certainly should obey them. Some of you have parents who are not saved. But even if they're not saved, remember the office of parenthood which they occupy is ordained by God. And when you disobey, you're disobeying God unless the parent definitely tells you to do something that contradicts the Bible. And oh, how important that is. Because there are lots of people who have unsaved parents and they just say, well, they're not Christians, won't pay any attention to them. The office they occupy is ordained of God, whether they're Christians or not. And